Well, let's move ahead then with hiring. You probably recognize this, this illusion on the screen. When you hire, it's very important that you choose wisely and you don't choose poorly. Because people can be the greatest train wreck to your ministry. People can be the greatest asset your church has, and they can be by far the greatest liability that your church has. And so as you select people, you are determining really the strength of your church. Why is hiring such an important issue? Let me give you a few reasons. Number one, because it will determine the effectiveness of your church. A church is only as productive as its staff allows it to be. Secondly, because of the church's reputation. Listen, your church will be judged by your weakest employee, or at least the weakest employee that people come in contact with. If your receptionist leads people to the conclusion that they're not wanted there, they have all of a sudden made the conclusion from the treatment of the church receptionist that that's how you as the pastor feel about them. Same thing with every aspect of the employees of the church. Members and visitors will often evaluate a church's integrity and its effectiveness by their encounters with the staff. There are a few occasions, I get a number of letters very positive about our staff here at Grace Church, but on occasion we'll get a negative letter about how a particular staff member treated a member or a visitor or whatever. And they become convinced that that somehow is the brush with which the rest of the church should be painted. You do that to some degree. You go into a department store and there's an employee who treats you poorly. What do you conclude, sort of without even thinking about it? That's the way the store is run. When in fact, that may be one bad apple in a group of wonderful people. And so, very important, it affects your reputation. Also, because of the law, it's important to hire well. In ignorance, churches regularly break the law in their hiring practices, and we'll deal with some of those. For example, interview questions. There are questions you can and can't ask. Some churches today have on their application a birth date. That is a year of birth date. You can't ask anything that will lead you to possibly discriminate against this person on the basis of age. But many churches do that regularly, and they violate the law in that process. And we'll deal with some more issues like that. Time. Hiring the right people is an important issue because there is no greater drain on a pastor's time than problem people, whether it's on the staff or in the membership, but particularly on the staff. The greatest problems those in authority have to address are people problems, and the best way to avoid those problems is to hire the right kind of people to begin with. History is another reason that this today should be important to you. What do I mean by that? Most churches' history, I dare say if I went around and asked a number of you about the churches you come from, if there were issues and problems with employees in the church, whether stealing from the church, splitting the church, getting, in some way endangering life or limb or purity of somebody in the church, this is a common problem. Most churches' history makes it clear that they can do better. If you look at the firing ratios of churches, fire to hire ratios, they're higher than they ought to be. If you look at the major discipline issues on the staff in many churches, you realize that they haven't been as careful in this area as they ought to be. So these are a few reasons that it's important to get this right. Now, although you can't avoid all problems, this is true in every area. Solomon makes this clear in Ecclesiastes when he's talking about life in the world. He says, listen, if you're a logger, then you're very likely to be hurt by the axe that you're wielding against the log. And if you dig a pit, you're likely to fall into it. There's a certain amount of risk and danger that goes with living in the world, period. And you can't get rid of all of that risk. One of your classmates is involved in sort of trying to mitigate risk in various organizations, and that's worthwhile. But he and I were talking, it's impossible to get rid of all risk. But with that said, in most cases, churches just aren't careful enough in their hiring. Either their philosophy of hiring was skewed or the process was flawed. And we want to talk about both of those today. The philosophy and the process of hiring the right people for your church. We're going to start, obviously, with the philosophy. Let's start with a common assumption that the people that you're looking to hire are Christians. That's hopefully an obvious thing that you're going to inquire into their testimony. Let's assume they're Christians. And let's assume they meet the spiritual qualifications for the job. You have 5 people, if you're in a little larger church, 5 people applying for this one position that's open, the church receptionist, let's say. How are you going to decide between those 5 people? What criteria are you going to use? Assuming they're all Christians and assuming they all meet the spiritual qualifications, what criteria are you going to use to hire that church receptionist? Well, let me give you some possible reasons. Work experience. That's very popular. Let's look and see what they've done before. Have you served as a receptionist before? How many phones did you help to direct? How many lines did you answer, etc.? Interpersonal skills. Are they able to get along well with other employees? Acquaintance. You know them. You know, it's Cousin Sue or so forth. Job-related skills. Let's give them some tests. Let's sit them in front of a switchboard and see if they can run it. And let's see how well they do at typing. Maybe we're going to get them to do some work in between phone calls. Aptitude. That is just innate brightness and ability to show the capacity to learn quickly. Attitude. A very positive attitude, excited about working at the church, etc. And then the final, not one I recommend, and that is breathing. Is there breath in their body? Let me just tell you here, some churches take this approach to hiring, but there's one thing worse than not having an employee, and that's having one you wish you didn't. So don't take this final criteria as the way to hire somebody for your church. Now, let me just ask you to do something. If you were hiring a position, let's say receptionist, just because we've already used that as an illustration, which of these, let's have you pick 3. Don't tell anyone around you. Just sort of look at the list and pick the 3 that would be the most important to you in choosing the church receptionist. And kind of make a decision. In just a moment, I want to show you what others have said about this. Now, there are literally dozens of census, I guess not censi, and surveys that have been done on this issue among workers in secular organizations and Fortune 500 companies and so forth. Guess what the top 3 are, and I would suggest to you are the top 3 that you should use as well. Here they are, the big 3. Attitude is number 1. Does that surprise you? Aptitude is number 2. Why aptitude, by the way? Because, and this is interesting, they have found that there is a significant link between a person's aptitude, that is their quickness to learn and solve problems and so forth. There's a link between that and initiative. People who have a high degree of aptitude, who learn quickly, who are bright, also show a great deal of initiative. They don't just sit back and wait for somebody to tell them what to do. And interpersonal skills. Those are the big 3 that in the secular world there is a huge consensus around those 3, and frankly, I can't improve on these either. If you assume that your applicants are believers and that they're spiritually qualified, and you want to sort of narrow between the rest of them, this is where I would encourage you to go. Let's just see, how many of you got all 3 of those? Very good. Well done. Now, before we leave this, let me ask you, why didn't the surveys of these HR professionals from all over the corporate world choose the others. Let's sort of analyze their thinking here. For example, job skills. Wouldn't you think that job skills would be really important in hiring someone to do a job, that they've been a receptionist before? It's interesting. A nationwide survey of managers agreed that they would rather have someone with adequate skills who can get along well with fellow workers than someone with superior skills who can't. Those of you who've been in positions of management, you can appreciate that. What about work experience? I said job skills for that first one, I hope. Job skills, that's why job skills aren't the most important. But what about work experience? You look at their resume and you see a great deal of work in that specific area. Why wouldn't that be so important? Well, just look at your golf game. Or better yet, look at my golf game. Practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes what? Permanent. It has to be the right kind of practice to make someone excel. So the fact that they've been sitting in a chair doing a specific job for 50 years doesn't make them good at it. So job experience alone is not a testimony to their capacity to do that job. Yes, sir?
Looking at seeing they're doing the same thing for a number of years would be a negative sign in my mind. But if I saw them starting off in a lower level and working their way up progressively, excelling, it might show me that they have attitude, aptitude, interpersonal.
Oh, absolutely. And we'll talk about, the question was, can't you see a progression? Maybe they haven't been doing the same thing for 50 years, but they've shown a progression along the way and grown from job to job. Yes, that can be a very positive tip-off. We'll talk about applications and sort of analyzing applications in a few minutes. That's one of those skills that's very important. But just work experience alone, the fact that they've been at a particular company doing the same job for a particular amount of time does not mean that they're good at it. It just means that that company has kept them. Maybe they're good, maybe they're not. Maybe they're in a bureaucracy where it's hopelessly impossible to fire someone who's incompetent. What about acquaintance? Now, wouldn't that seem reasonable at a church? I mean, after all, we are to sort of know the person and approve them, sort of have a period of testing and make sure that we're confident in their both their character and their skills. Well, there are two insidious problems with hiring solely for this reason. And by the way, many churches do this. I know them. They're here. They're in our church. And I wouldn't encourage you to hire people outside your church. I'm saying that you don't hire solely for this purpose, just because they're there and they seem to be interested. You may know their personality, but you haven't really seen them in a work environment. Also, your choices, if you take that approach, are only as wide as your circle of acquaintance. Maybe there's another person sitting in your 200-member church in the back that if they knew about this job, they are more gifted and more skilled and more capable and would display a better attitude, aptitude, and interpersonal skills. So you're settling if you just do it solely based on who you know. You may be settling on an average employee because you're unaware of others who may be excellent. You wouldn't use this logic for choosing a plumber, and I hope you didn't use it for choosing a wife. Well, you know, I knew her. Hopefully you beat the bushes a little more than that. What I would suggest to you that there are many positions in the church that you would take applications for. We do that here at Grace Church. You take applications. For example, a receptionist would be one of those. My secretary, when Dan Dumas's wife wanted to begin to pursue a family, and she left me. The audacity. I needed to replace her, and so we took applications for that job. For other jobs, such as more of the pastoral jobs, I think we operate more then on a recommendation basis, but we still go through a process to identify not just that we know them, but that they have the skills to do the job. All right, with that in mind, that's a philosophy. You want to know what to look for when you're hiring? You keep these three in mind, and I promise you, if you keep these three and you're diligent to pursue these three across your staff, you will have a good staff. Because if you have people who have a positive attitude, who want to be there, who love the church, and you have people who have aptitude, they're bright, they're quick studies, and you have people who have good people skills, they'll get the jobs done. They may not have experience in those fields, but they'll learn those fields, and they'll find a way to get it done and done well.
When you're searching for a pastor, if you're in a smaller church that doesn't have the contacts that Grace has, what do you recommend for searching?
The question is, how do you go about, if you're in a smaller church, searching for pastors if you don't have that many within your congregation to really choose from? Well, I would encourage the elders to start by looking within the congregation. I think that's always the first stop. You know, Paul says in 2 Corinthians 2:2 that you're to pass on the truth, the sound doctrine, to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. The implication is, if you know they're faithful, you know they're able to teach, you know them. There's a real relationship that's been built. And so that's always the first stop. But and there are occasions when that doesn't happen, and it's particularly in the small rural churches where you just don't have that available, then of course from there you begin the process of taking applications. And many of the principles we're going to talk about here would apply even to the pastoral function. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And I think as we go along, maybe a couple more will be answered, so it'll be filled out a little more. Okay. All right, let's talk about then the process. The philosophy is very simple. Hire people who are positive in their outlook and attitude, who are bright and able to learn quickly, and then who have good people skills. And they can learn whatever skills they need to learn along the way. Now, that doesn't mean you ignore skills. If you have two people who have those big three, but one of them has more experience than the other, then of course that enters in. I'm not saying you just throw that out the window. But for example, when I'm hiring a secretary, I don't necessarily look for someone who has been doing that job for 30 years. Maybe they may be great, but there may be a person who shows a higher aptitude who's younger, and I don't eschew that at all. I think that's, if they have these three things and the other doesn't, then that weighs out heavier in my mind. The presence of these three things is heavier than years of experience. All right? Now, the process. And this is a general process. It'll vary a little bit in your specific situation, but this is essentially the flow that you will need to follow if you're hiring, frankly, any position. Starts with advertising. And by that, I don't mean anything like the paper. I just mean you have to get the word out that this position's available. If you do it solely based on acquaintance, then again, you're limiting the potential that there may be someone in the congregation who really has those skills that you don't know about. So somehow you have to let it be known. We do that, if you notice, in Grace Today. In the back of Grace Today, there's a little section that says job opportunities, and we list whatever openings that we have there. In many cases, there are a few cases where, for example, we want to hire an intern. Obviously, we don't need to advertise to the general church body because that's strictly for seminary students. But if it's the kind of job that anyone in our church could fill, then we put it in Grace Today. Then people respond to that, and you will send them applications or tests, or you'll have them fill out something that lets you know a little bit about them. There are standard applications that you can purchase. There are some that you can get from church resource groups and so forth. But you have an application, and perhaps, depending on the job, some tests that go along with it. Then you receive those applications back, and you have the responsibility to sort through them. Let me tell you how this works. This is going to be a little discouraging to you, but let's just talk about you're applying to be a youth pastor in a church. Here's how it works. A larger church who needs a youth pastor, well, even a smaller church. I talked to a church on an island off the coast of Washington, I think it was, up there on the northwest somewhere, and they had a fairly small church. I think it was 150 people. They had 30 applications for one opening that they had. Now, that church is not going to go through every one of those applications with a fine-tooth comb. Here's what they're going to do. they're going to establish a grid. They're going to say, okay, we want a minimum of an MDiv. So they're going to take those applications, and right away they're going to make 2 stacks. They're going to go through, no MDiv, he's in this stack. MDiv, he's over here. No MDiv, MDiv. And right away they're going to send thank you but no thanks letters to those who don't meet that grid, whatever that is. Sometimes it also includes ministry experience. Then they're going to look from there at the ones that meet the grid. And they're going to look at those a little more closely. But that's what I mean by sorting the applications. You're fairly quickly deciding those that you don't want based on the criteria you've established. Then you evaluate the applications. We'll talk about how to do that in a minute. The ones that meet your grid, that you kind of put in the keep stack, you evaluate those a little more carefully. And then you schedule interviews with those after you've evaluated the applications, all of those that you think may in fact be a good fit for this specific role. Then after you've done the interviews, you graciously notify the non-hires, those people that you're not going to hire. You don't leave them hanging. You know, many times they're without work or at least they're in a difficult situation. So as soon as you can, graciously let them know that you're not going to be hiring them. You do that. You conduct a second interview. Now you've narrowed your pool from that first interview. You've narrowed your pool to a group of probably 1, 2, at the most 3 people that you think are the greatest likelihood to fill this position well. And you conduct a second interview. We'll talk about why and how a little later. Then after you've basically chosen the one you want, before you offer them a job, after the second interview, or you could do the references before the second interview, even before the first interview. Again, you can tweak this a little bit. This is just a basic flow. You call the references and you find out what they have to say about this person. And we'll talk about the importance of that and how to do that. I'll even give you a little form to use in that process. Yes, sir?
I was going to talk about that. When people generally put a reference on a resume, they put people that will give them a good recommendation. So I was wondering, I guess you'll...
Absolutely, I will cover that. In fact, there's an overarching principle here that he was touching on, and that is when people put a reference on a recommendation, or I should say a recommendation or a reference on an application, they are obviously going to put somebody who's going to give this glowing comment about them. How do you get around that? We'll talk about that. Then after you've decided based on what you've seen and what these other people have told you that this is the person, then you make a job offer. That's very specific. We want you to take this role. Here's what we'd like to offer you to do this. It may be informal. It may be over coffee. It may be formal. You call them on the phone and so forth. And then you make sure that whatever paperwork needs to be processed is processed. For example, in the state of California, and I can't speak for every state, I believe this is national, but don't quote me on that. There is a form, the I-9 form, that has to be filled out before an employee works his first minute. So there is usually paperwork that has to be completed, legal kind of paperwork. And then there should be some sort of an orientation where somebody, whether it's you, if it's a pastoral staff member and you're the senior pastor, or if it's the receptionist, whoever oversees the reception area, or if you're a larger church like ours, you have an HR department, human resources department. They meet with new employees and take them through a checklist of here's some things you need to know, from what you need to wear to the basic hours to, et cetera, and to the benefits and how to take advantage of those benefits on down the line. All right? Now we'll go through each of these or several of these in some detail here as we go. Yes, sir? I'm sorry?
Medical checkup?
Medical checkup? That's not required. We don't require that as a church. There are, depending on the jobs, there are some special outside tests that have to be done. For example, if we're going to hire a nursery worker, and we'll get to this when we talk about legal liability, if we're going to hire a nursery worker, then they have to be fingerprinted, and their fingerprints have to clear that, in fact, there's not a sexual offense on their record, some sort of pedophilia or whatever on their record, so that they can work with children. So there are some of those kinds of things you have to do, but not medical per se. We don't require that. Some may. Yes, sir?
What are the pros and cons in the advertising
part of giving information on the benefits and the hourly pay, and some people that are interested in maybe a job like that might say, oh no, that's not even close to what I want to get, or
Sure.
that's something
The question is, and again, I'm repeating, maybe you all heard it, but I'm repeating for the video, and so they can get that on video. But the question is it beneficial to include in your advertisement, in your church bulletin, or however you're doing it, some of the details about the pay, the benefits? We usually do not do that for just propriety reasons. You know, we don't, in some cases, it may be very commensurate, and we'll talk about arriving at good pay scales for your church workers, how to do that. But while it may be commensurate with what that job should be paying, there may be someone in your congregation who makes less than that and who's somewhat insulted that the church is paying that much, etc. So we don't usually advertise that way. We figure if someone wants this job and the Lord's at work in their hearts to do that, they'll be motivated to come forward. And even if that's an issue, they can inquire about that, and we can answer that as they're going through the process. Yes, sir?
How close would this process mimic what you would do with hiring a pastor? Would there be any changes?
The question is, how close would this process follow the hiring of a pastor? Well, our situation is a little unique because of the size of the church, because the seminary is located here, so there are men who've come through, and that begins to serve as the pool for us. And so there isn't quite as much advertising that would take place. There might not be, there will have to be an application filled out. That might not play quite as much as an important role in the hiring of a pastoral staff member, because hopefully he's a guy who's been here actually doing the work of ministry in some capacity for several years. So that's a little different. So it would be similar. I mean, we would have to, for example, interview them. That would be an important component. If we were looking at a couple of guys, we'd want to graciously let the other guy know that he wasn't going to be the one. So, and there might even be a second interview. Maybe if Student Ministries is planning to hire somebody, and Rick wants me to be involved in meeting that person as well, or perhaps the high school group is hiring a worker of some kind, a secretary, and they want the head of Student Ministries to meet that person. A second interview might be important. I still think it's important to call references, and I'll get to that when I get there, why that's so important. At some point, you're going to have to tell them, here's what we're specifically offering you, and so forth. So many of these things are going to be the same, but there are a few of them that will be tweaked, particularly on the front end. You know, the sort of sorting through applications, and there might not be as much of that.
I guess what I was referring to specifically is, looks like you just have interviews taking place. There's nothing about meeting a church or preaching in front of a church or being involved in ministry.
Right. This process would change significantly for a senior pastor. This primarily would be for someone at a pastoral level and a departmental level and below. Okay, so if you're talking about a senior pastor, then this process is going to look considerably different. Although, you're still going to advertise, you're still going to have a way to take applications. So it's going to take a slightly different sort of look and feel, but the basic flow is not going to go away, even if it's for a senior pastor. You're just going to include some other things in here. For example, if it's a senior pastor, you're going to want him to come preach. You're going to have him meet with the elders, and there's going to be sort of an exchange of where is this guy theologically and biblically on a number of issues, and on and on. You're probably going to have him write a detailed theological summary of his theological position, etc.
That you do that with like a youth pastor, have them see how they interact with the youth group themselves and leaders in the group?
Well, yes. I mean, that is important. Again, I'm talking primarily from our field of experience, and with us, that person would have already been involved in ministry at some level, probably in student ministries, let's say, if they were going to be ushered into that. But if not, then yes, they would go in, they'd be exposed, they'd teach, and kind of see the response, and let the staff meet the lay staff meet them, and see if it's a good fit, so forth. So yeah, this is not complete. It's just a flow. There would be some things inserted here, particularly for the higher level positions, and a few of these things would go away for some of the higher level positions. All right. Now let's talk more specifically about some of these things. particularly evaluating applications. You've sort of sorted, you've got these applications. Again, we're talking about either a church hiring a senior pastor, a church hiring a youth pastor from outside. They don't have anybody in their congregation that fits. Or you're a larger church hiring receptionists, accountants, facility staff, etc. How are you going to evaluate the applications? There are several key things to look for when you look at an application. You now got this guy's application sitting in front of you. First of all, look at the timeliness of submitting. You can learn a lot about how they respond. If they were really fast getting it in, if they return it in an unusually short period of time, they're probably eager. They probably are out of work and they may be overeager. That may be a good sign, maybe a bad one, but you just need to be aware of that. Are they undisciplined? Do they fail to return it when they say they will or by the designated time? Well, guess what? If they can't get the application in on time, what does that probably mean about the project you give them in 3 months? Are they thorough? Again, you want someone who does thorough, excellent work. If on the application they leave blanks everywhere and they don't give you, they didn't read the question well, and so their answer doesn't fit the question, then that tells you something about this person's approach. When I was hiring for a secretary, in fact, this happened several times at Grace to You in different roles, and then here at the church. It was interesting because I give one very difficult test, and when I'm hiring, I'm not going to give you this one because it's kind of my secret weapon. It's a test I give that I have never found to fail in identifying detail-oriented people. But I can't give it to you because then you'll use it in the future to sort of cheat and get in. No, I'm just kidding. But I knew this test is extremely difficult, and people who understand detail orientation look at it, and then after about 5 minutes they realize this is a lot more than I thought it was. In fact, Jane Dumas, who was my secretary for a number of years, when she saw it, she immediately went to the library and checked out 5 books. That's how detail-oriented people react. But several people filled it out in 10 minutes in the lobby. That told me something about them. So, as you look at the timeliness of submitting this thing, you can learn something about these people. The appearance of the form. Remember, you are getting, this is very important, you are getting in this application what should be the best these people have to offer you. So is it ripped? Does it have coffee stains? Looks like some of the papers you guys turn in. Does it have scratch outs? Is it typed? Is it neatly written? It reflects a lot about a person and the quality of work you can expect from them in the future. The level of articulateness. Remember, one of your goals is to identify those people who have aptitude. Guess what people who have aptitude have also? A better vocabulary. So look for the level of articulateness. And that goes along with this next one, vocabulary. Both how they put their words together in communication as well as their vocabulary. Their work history. I've already established with you that this is not the main issue. But there are some danger signs to look for when you look at applications. You do want to look at the work history for some red flags. And let me give you a few. First of all, if after their school years, obviously when you know how it goes, when you're in school you have a number of different jobs, and that was true of you and probably everybody you know. But after the school years, if they have several brief tenures at jobs, they've been somewhere 8 months and they've been somewhere else 8 months or 5 months, and then they've been somewhere a year and then been somewhere 3 months. That doesn't necessarily mean they'll be a bad employee, but it should be a red flag. It should make you wonder why. Do they not get along with the people? Do they become disenchanted with their coworkers or their boss or their job? Are they the kind of people who just never can be satisfied with the pay they're receiving? What's What's going on? And that ought to be a little flag you make. And if you do go ahead and interview this person, you ought to graciously sort of find out what went on with these brief tenures. Another danger sign in work history is if in the application they are critical toward their former employers. Normally in an application, and the applications you would use probably would have this, here's your job that you had, what period of time, what was your responsibility, and reason for leaving. Why did you leave? It is absolutely shocking to me what people will write in that blank. You know, I had a dirt bag for a boss. Well, guess what? If they are that free to talk about their former employer in an application, what does that probably mean will happen to you? You'll be the next dirt bag, exactly. If on their application there are negative reasons for leaving several jobs, again, it's not uncommon for a person to have to leave a job for a negative reason. You maybe had to do that. But if there's several of them like that, that should be a red flag. It's not necessarily a death blow, but it ought to be a red flag to you. If the people they list as knowing, you know, again, normally there's this thing that says people you know at our company or at our church or whatever. If the people they list as knowing are problem people, that's not a good sign. You know, if they list the person on staff they know as the worst employee you have, what does that probably say? Ornithological creatures of similar plumage congregate in close proximity. Okay, birds of a feather flock together. So be aware of that. If their testimony is weak, again, on a church application, you're going to have a spot for them to share their testimony. If their testimony is weak, or if there are little doctrinal things thrown in that show that they don't really know where your church is from a biblical or doctrinal standpoint, then guess what? They're bringing some baggage. That doesn't mean, again, that you don't hire them. It just means you better flag that. You better find out why they're saying in their testimony that, they went to a psychotherapy clinic one weekend and it revolutionized their life. So, just beware. By the way, many of the illustrations I'm giving you are actual illustrations from experiences I've had. Yes?
I'm not familiar with California law, but if I understand correctly, Grace has a requirement that employees be members.
That's
so
right.
I was curious as to, one, the rationale for that, but then two, how you get away with that legally.
Okay, there are a couple of questions here. First is, does Grace Church require employees to be members? And the answer is yes, we do. And the other question is then, if you do require that, how do you get around that legally? There have been some caveats made for churches in the hiring process. We can discriminate on the basis of religion, for example. And we can establish, as all companies do, a certain moral code that they have to meet. And if they don't meet that, or if they fail to meet it, we can let them go legally. So that's fine. There will be issues. If your church is like ours, there will be issues where you are going to simply have to do what you do because you believe it's what the Scripture teaches, even if you're exposing yourself to some degree to risk for wrongful hiring or firing practices. You just need to make sure that you've done as much as you can to have that in your bylaws, in your application, in your orientation process, so everybody knew this is where you are and why. Always, if you attach from the Scripture why you believe this is true. Does that mean you'll win in court? No, it doesn't. But at least you've shown that what your practices are tied to your faith and what you believe that the Bible enjoins you to do. And so far, the courts have shown a great deal of latitude. They've not been really willing to get into it when churches' hiring and firing practices are truly based on their convictions of what the Scriptures teach. Will that day possibly come? It might. We might end up losing tax exemption because we don't hire certain kinds of people who either aren't a part of our church or don't believe like we believe or whatever. But, our mothers of young children, those may become issues down the road. But we have to do what we believe the Scripture teaches and let the chips fall where they may. be gracious about it, but do what we think is right. We need to take every opportunity to have our ducks in line legally and only be out of line where we believe the Scripture clearly commands it, and document that clearly as well. Yes?
Mothers of young children, I didn't get that.
Yeah, at Grace Church, we do not allow mothers with young children in the home to work full-time on our staff. That's what we believe the Scriptures teach, and we've been consistent with it. Is it possible that that could be somewhere down the road a problem for us legally? Of course. But so could the fact that we won't hire homosexuals as well. So we have to stick with what we believe the Scriptures teach and let the chips fall. Yes, sir. Just a couple more questions here.
The employees at Grace Community Church are supposed to be deacon qualified, is that correct?
That's correct.
And are they actually deacons on the list?
The question is, the employees at Grace Community Church are supposed to be deacon or deaconess qualified, and the answer is yes. And are they actually listed as deacons or deaconesses on the list? And the answer to that is no. The key word is qualified. It doesn't mean that they have to be actually functioning, although our hope would be that they would be. I mean, basically a deacon or deaconess in our church is simply someone who meets the character qualifications and who is serving. It's that simple. So hopefully they would be on the list. But the key issue is, are they qualified to be on the list? That's what we've maintained all along. All right. Yes, sir.
Very important word that you said there was consistent. You're consistent whether it's hiring no young mothers or homosexuals. You're consistent. That's legally.
Yeah. The question is, obviously it's important for this to be consistent. Whatever this is, you're practicing in your hiring practices from conscience, from the teachings of Scripture, has to be consistently practiced. And the answer is yes. You want to get yourself in serious trouble, do this and be inconsistent with it. Then you've proven that it's not really a conviction. It's not really something you believe God enjoins us to do.
How do you get away with the laws of not hiring foreign nationals?
How do we, I'm sorry?
In terms of not hiring foreign nationals?
Well, not hiring foreign nationals. That's a sticky issue because legally we're not allowed to hire for certain positions non-U.S. citizens. I mean, the government restricts us from doing that, and so we don't do that. There can, in certain cases, certain sets of criteria have to be met, and if those criteria are met, then for certain positions in certain circumstances, that can happen, but it's uncommon. So generally, we're not allowed to hire non-U.S. citizens. So except in those specific circumstances, and there are several different ones. I'm not going to get into specifics, but all right. That's it for today then. No, let's do one more thing before you leave. There's one more on this slide. Specific tests. As you look at the application, you also want to look at whatever tests you gave them, whether it's typing, if they're in that kind of role, or whether it's writing a sample letter. I have people write sample letters who are going to work for me not because I want them to write letters, because I want to test their logic. I'll give them a scenario and say, write a letter, and I'll give them 20 minutes to do it. And that tells me if they're logical, if they can communicate, etc. So whatever tests you give people as you evaluate applications, look at those tests, and I put a great deal of emphasis on those and in ranking these applications that I have left. We'll pick it up there next time in terms of where you go from here. Thank you. All right, we're talking about hiring, and as I mentioned to you last week, there's nothing really more important than that. If you choose wisely in hiring the right people, it will save you a great deal of time, but it'll also improve your effectiveness. It'll keep your reputation from being tarnished, keep you within the bounds of the law, save you a great deal of time, as I mentioned, and history shows that churches can do this better than we do them. So we looked briefly at a philosophy of hiring. We said there were a number of possible reasons. You could hire for work experience, interpersonal skills, because you know them, because they have some skills that relate to that specific job, because they're just intelligent, bright, show a great deal of aptitude, they have a good attitude, or they're simply breathing. And we said the last one is contraindicated, as they say. Why should you hire a person? Let's assume your employees, or rather the applicants for the job, are all believers and they're all spiritually qualified for the job. What should you look for? And we said really these three: attitude, aptitude, and interpersonal skills. That ought to be where you begin in choosing the right people to serve in your ministry. Then we started looking at the process of hiring. And we said, of course, you need to somehow let people know about the job, that it exists, whether that's through your bulletin or some other way. You need to then provide applications for them to fill out and any appropriate tests. You need to sort those applications as they come back in. You're going to have some sort of a grid by which you look at each of those applications and determine which ones you ought to consider. And then once you've sorted them, you take the ones that are in your acceptable stack, that have met the grid you've established, and then you evaluate them. And we talked about last time some ways to do that. Scheduling interviews, notifying the non-hires, conducting a second interview, calling the references, making a job offer, and then doing the necessary paperwork. And then, of course, you should have some sort of an orientation checklist to orient this new employee to life at your church. Now, we talked about evaluating those applications several different ways. Look at how timely they were in submitting it, the appearance of the form itself, how well do they communicate, what about their vocabulary. Look at their work history, and primarily here you're looking for danger signs, and we talked about several of those last time. For example, they had a very short tenure at a number of jobs after they graduated from school. Those kinds of things are a real danger. They're criticizing their former bosses or employers in an obvious way, etc. And then you need to evaluate the specific tests you gave them to determine if they had the skills for that particular job. Now, we left off with the interview. Let me talk briefly about setting up interviews. A couple of little things that I think will be helpful to you. First of all, interview every candidate that is a possibility. Once you've evaluated the applications, don't just interview the ones that really shine at the very top. Interview all of those that you think are a possibility. And the reason for that is sometimes, again, a person looks better on paper than they are in person. And sometimes a person isn't quite as effectively at communicating on paper as they are face-to-face. And so by interviewing them, you get to know this person a little better, and some things might jump out at you either negatively or positively. Schedule all the interviews to occur within a reasonably close time of each other. In other words, don't interview one person this week, another person 3 weeks from now for that same job. And the reason is, by scheduling them close together, it enables you to compare better the candidates. Schedule the same amount of time per interview. For example, what I'll often do is just take a couple of days, and I'll plan on an hour per interview. If it's an important position that is a sort of support position. If it's going to be a pastor, obviously it's going to be much more involved than this. But so it varies. But I'm talking now more about support staff. You schedule time between them so that you can make your notes and you can think through what you encountered in that interview. So don't put them back to back. You don't want them running into each other, one in and one out on the way out of the lobby. And then that, as I said, gives you time to complete your notes and make sure you know what you need to know about that person. Now, the interview itself. There's a very important key issue that you need to understand when it comes to the interview. And that is, the applicant will do everything possible to present his or her absolute best. Your job is like that of a detective, looking for clues to the real person. You know, it's hard to know for sure what you're looking at. They're going to present a certain face to you when in fact it may be another face altogether. And so your job is to try to understand this concept that the key issue is you're a detective. Sometimes you do things that are well, a little unusual. I used to, when I was at Grace to You, for example, and I was hiring for a secretarial position, and I did this even here at Grace Church, is leave the applicant in the lobby about 5 or 10 minutes. And I would cue the receptionist that I wanted them just to visit with them, talk with them. Because people, again, are putting their best foot forward when they're meeting with me. But I wanted to know if they were rude to the receptionist while they were waiting downstairs, or if they couldn't carry on a conversation with a coworker. And so there are things you can do to try to discern that. Proverbs 20, verse 14, you've read it in a number of times, I'm sure, but it says, "Bad, bad, says the buyer, but when he goes his way, then he boasts." Obviously talking about your wife's flea market approach. You hear this all the time if your wife enjoys that, but it's more than that. This is a warning to inexperienced people that people purposefully seek to present a certain image of themselves that may or may not be true. And so your job as the interviewer is to try your best to discern who this person is. Now, how do you do that? Well, here are the key interviewing skills that you need to consider. You obviously need to get the person as relaxed as possible so that they'll let their guard down. And so you really see who they are. They're not putting up a false front. You really are getting to know them. Now, you say, boy, this is awfully skeptical about Christian people coming to your office to interview for a church position. This is just reality. That's not to say that they intend to deceive you. They are simply putting forward their absolute best because they want the job. And so your job is to try to discern if there are other things there that you need to know as well. How do you do that? Ask open-ended questions. If you don't do this already with your wife, you're not being a very good husband. Don't ask her, "So honey, how was your..." No, don't ask her, "Did you have a good day?" How can she respond to that? Yes or no. Now, did that really spur a conversation? Probably not. Instead, ask her, "So, honey, tell me about your day." I'm giving you little tips here, even for your marriages. I just want you to know this. Try that on, and I'm telling you, she will tell you about her day. And that will start a conversation. Same thing is true in interviewing. Ask open-ended questions. In other words, not questions that call for yes or no answers, but questions that get them talking. Tell me about yourself. So, tell me how you came to know the Lord. What was your church background like? Those are open-ended questions that get them talking about themselves. And then as they get to talking, you learn a lot about them. Second key interviewing skill is listen carefully, not merely for content, but for clues. You're listening for clues to their theological or biblical issues that would keep them from being a good fit. I alluded last week to one interview I had where the gal, I asked her, "So, tell me how you came to know the Lord." And she went through the story of how she came to Christ. And up to that point, it was okay. And then she said, "But I really struggled for a long time in my Christian life until I went away for a weekend psychological encounter where I really came to see how some of the things from my past that I'd even forgotten enlightened me to who I really was." Ding, ding, ding. I'm thinking, okay, when's my next interview? Why? Because obviously she wouldn't have been a good fit for Grace Church, for the organizations connected here. Even though she was attending, her theology was skewed a different direction. I wanted her to keep attending, be exposed to the truth, and correct her thinking, but I didn't want to do that while she was on staff. Yes?
How would you carefully, that's especially at the beginning of your interview, how would you carefully wind that down so that you're not...
Good question. What happens if you discover early on in the interview that this isn't going to work? This person is not the right person, the right fit. I usually, just to be gracious, go through the normal interview process with them. I'm sure I shortcut it a little bit here and there. I may not take a full hour. It may only be 45 minutes. but I try to give them an adequate hearing. And also, in case maybe I didn't get the picture clearly, maybe over time something else will come out that will make it clear I misunderstood them or something. So I give them essentially a normal interview. But you're listening carefully for theological or biblical issues, how well they really understand your church and your theology. Again, you want people on your staff who are supportive of those things that make your church distinctive. If your church is, in its theology, clearly reformed, and in the process of the interview, this person is sort of oozing a sort of man-centered gospel, then guess what? That's not a good fit. And those are the kinds of things you're listening for. Attitudes toward former employers, attitudes toward spouses, all of that can come up if you ask open-ended questions. It's shocking, really, what people who feel a little bit of pressure in an interview will say about themselves, and I'll allude to some of those in a few minutes that I think are pretty funny, actually. You're trying to listen through their answers to see their personality. Are they going to be an easy person for coworkers to enjoy and to work with? Do they have a sense of humor? Do they laugh easily at themselves? Are they awkward and sort of socially misfit, or are they going to be good people persons? For their character, you can learn a lot about a person if you get them talking for about an hour. You can learn a lot about what goes on inside of them. So, all of those things. And then you also need to keep careful notes. I encourage you to do that. I always say, as I'm meeting a person, I'll say, I hope you don't mind if I take some notes. I have a good memory. It's just really short. Make some cracks so that it's obvious that I'm just writing it down from my memory so they don't feel like they're in a test or something. But that helps me, because if I've interviewed 4 or 5 different people, then I've got the key issues written down there, and my mind will quickly recall the specifics as I see my little notes that I've made. Now, conducting the interview, let me ask you to look at those things I passed out to you there. There's several sheets stapled together. Let me just give you a little warning. This is not a full legal brief on what you can and can't do in the interview. This is just to show you that you need to be careful in interviews. You cannot ask, that top sheet there, you cannot ask the date of birth or the age of the person. I mentioned that last time. You can ask, are you over 18? And if you're under 18, can you submit a work permit? Why, by the way? Why can't you answer that question? Age discrimination. You might discriminate them on the basis of age. You can't ask their height or weight. You cannot ask their maiden name. You can ask if they've changed their name so that you can check necessary references. You can't ask race or color. You can't ask national origin. But you can ask what languages they might know, only if it's relevant to the job they're going to be doing. This is an interesting one. Work days. You cannot ask them how many work days they missed because of sickness or illness. Why? Americans with Disabilities Act. You might discriminate against that person on the basis of their disability. Maybe they were out because of their approved disability. But you can't ask a general question. How would you rate your overall attendance record? And if you know an applicant is disabled, you cannot ask questions that would reveal the nature or severity of the disability. But you can ask questions about their abilities to do the job in question, specific skills in the job in question. That's just to highlight for you that there are very clear and specific laws determining what's appropriate in hiring and what isn't. Now, why is that important for a church? Well, first of all, because the Lord tells us through Peter that we're to obey every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. Secondly, it's important because if you ask some of these questions, you can be sued as a church for discriminating in hiring if that person isn't hired. Yes? No, the ADA, well, there are a couple of issues going on here. Most of these are across the country. The age discrimination and the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, is across the country. So you have to be careful of these anywhere. And these aren't all of them, by the way. This is just a sampling. I'm not in a position to give you all the legal counsel you need. I'm just here to sort of raise your antenna about these issues. Yes?
The issue of, I don't understand this too well, saying, well, are you a Christian? No, I'm not. Well, I'm sorry that we can't hire you. Discriminating that on quote-unquote religion. And also, women, I want to be your senior pastor. I'm sorry, we don't hire women to be pastors. Okay, I'm discriminating against sex as well.
Question is, how does the law go with the issue of hiring in a church a person who isn't a Christian? In other words, asking them whether or not they're a Christian and not hiring them if they say they're not a Christian. Or if you have, let's say you're hiring for a pastor and a woman applicant presents her application. As I said last time, in some of these areas, when it comes to hiring and employment practices, we have to do as believers what our consciences, bound by the Scripture, tell us we have to do. The key thing there is to be consistent, to make sure it's carefully spelled out in your employee hiring practices, and that you're consistent with it across the board. On the issue of hiring unbelievers, the law has been clear that, or is clear, that churches are not forced to hire. They have a little bit of a loophole out of some of the requirements on discriminatory hiring, in that they're not required to hire people who don't embrace what they believe. And so, for example, we have a qualification here at Grace Church that we seek to be consistent with. Not always perfect in this area, and when we find out about it, we try to deal with it. But that they have to be deacon or deaconess qualified. And so that goes not only to the fact that they profess to be a believer, but also that they have character qualifications that would match the scriptural texts. So that's the issue. When it comes to a woman pastor, we clearly believe and teach, and we've consistently held that's what the Scripture teaches. Does that mean that we're out from under any potential litigation because of that? No, it's very possible that down the road someone could sue us on those issues. So be it. We have to do what the Scripture compels us to do. And if we end up being hurt by that financially, even worst case scenario, perhaps losing our tax exemption, then the Lord will honor that. We're confident. Yes?
It might be helpful just to explain how those don'ts are enforced.
You mean the penalties?
Well, yeah. How are these rules enforced?
The question is, how are these rules that I've alluded to here enforced? There are a couple there are several ways a person who feels you have discriminated against them can pursue. First, they can pursue civil litigation. They can also, there are a couple of governmental agencies that interact with employment practices, and they can go to these, the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, I think is what it stands for. And there's one more, it escapes me right now, where they can go and present their case and say, I have been either discriminated against in hiring and firing, I've been mistreated in some way, and they can make an appeal. So there are several different directions they can go, and sometimes the damages can be monetary, sometimes they can be forced rehire with back pay, etc. And you've seen some of that in the news. There's a variety of ways those rulings can come down. All right. Now let's go briefly through the next page you got there in the handout, a sample interview. And this is not absolute. This is just an example. If you're interviewing a pastor, for example, you're going to spend a lot more time under the theological issues. You're probably going to have them submit a theological statement of what they believe. Sort of give me a running systematic theology. What do you believe about the various issues in Scripture? And then you're going to quiz them on that. You're going to send them your own doctrinal statement, ask for their input, what are the differences, and so forth. You're going to deal with some different issues. This is for sort of the rest of the staff. Most of your hiring in a church is going to be for support staff. If you looked at this church, the support staff largely outnumbers the pastoral staff. And in most churches that's true, just because you have to have a receptionist, you have to have a secretary, etc. Even in a smaller church where you may only have a couple of pastoral staff members. So I'm sort of concentrating there. Let me just run through this real briefly. This is an interview form I use. I start by briefly explaining the job. If there's a job description, I go through that very quickly, what the reporting relationships will be, hours, salary, etc. Then I move to, so now I'd like to get to know you a little bit. And I start with those open-ended questions. Tell me about yourself. How did you come to know the Lord? How did you learn about John, if they're from out of the area, or Grace Church? And there's one yes or no question because it's required, and that is, are you a member of Grace Community Church? Are you aware of any theological differences you have with us? You've read the doctrinal statement. You have to be a member, or in the process, what areas do you disagree with us? And I usually go through sort of our distinctives too, that may not necessarily be in the doctrinal statement. For example, there isn't a lot about gifts, that is, tongues, in the doctrinal statement. But I want to know where they are on those kinds of issues. So I'll sort of quiz them on those things as well. The place of psychology and sanctification, etc. Then I go to the specific job qualifications. Tell me about your skills in these various areas, whatever the skills may be for that job. These are just some examples. What about this position interests you? This goes to motive. And oftentimes, the response, instead of, the Lord has given me gifts, and I know I have a responsibility to serve and minister in the church, and I want to do that. I want to serve people. Sometimes you'll get the response, well, I really want to eventually get this other job, and this one is going to sort of give me the opportunity to do that. It's all about them. They really don't care about that specific job. It's all about sort of a stepping stone for them. You can learn a lot through asking motivation. Why did you leave your last job? These next two questions are crucial, and they tell you a lot about the person. I break it down two ways. I say, let's start first with you, just your character. Forget the job for a moment. Those people who know you best, what would they say are your major strengths? And then, in terms of the job that we're looking at, we're thinking about hiring you for, what would you say are the strengths you bring to that job? You can learn a lot through that, but you can learn a lot more through the next question. How would you describe from those people who know you best, how would they describe your character weaknesses, those areas in which you struggle just as a person? What weaknesses do you have? Well, if they can't come up with any, that's a bad sign, because that means they really don't know their own heart, and they don't know themselves very well. They'll also tell you a lot of interesting things. I had one person tell me, I asked this question, so tell me about the personal weaknesses that you may have that others would see and identify. Well, I'm not sure I'd call it a weakness, she said, but said, I have a tendency just to speak my mind and say what ought to be said, and some people are offended by that. And I don't understand that, but I guess some people would count that a weakness. Yeah, well, so do I. Let me write that one down. And then I go to the second half of the question. What would you say are the major weaknesses you bring to this job? Sometimes maybe there'll be specific skills. Sometimes they'll say it's experience. I really haven't done this before. I had one person tell me when I was hiring, it comes to mind because it's the latest position I've hired. I had one person tell me that when I asked about the weakness she brought to the job, she said, I think it is that I am just absolutely obsessed with doing it my way, with doing the job my way. And sometimes it bothers me when other people try to insert themselves into that process because I want to do it the way I want to do it. Okay, thank you. Thanks for your honesty. By the way, in case you missed it, that's not a person you want working for you, because what are you going to be doing all the time? Telling them what to do and sometimes how to do it. So you can learn a lot about people and their eccentricities through asking these questions, because they'll tell you. They'll tell you things that you'd be shocked you would learn in an interview. The second page, while I'm interviewing the person, I sort of go down and score these qualities, 1 to 10. Neatness, skills, how detail-oriented are they? Are they good conversationalists? In the case of someone who's going to be doing a lot of phone work, their phone voice, sense of humor. By the way, phone voice, I'll just give you a little clue here. I personally interview the receptionists that are going to be hired for Grace Church, because that is the voice and face of your church. That is what most people will conclude about your church, is that voice and that face. And she may be, or he, or whomever you end up with, may be the friendliest and nicest person on the planet. But if they spend 90% of their time on the phone and they have this voice that sounds like they're always mad, then it doesn't matter how sweet and kind they are. They're going to give that impression to everybody who calls. So that's why that's in there. Sense of humor, and they laugh at themselves. They have a reasonable degree of confidence, not pride, but they're not cowering in the corner, you know. And do they appear to be teachable? I try to find something to sort of throw back at them a little bit and give me a chance to see if they're going to respond well, if they're going to be teachable. And then I ask them if I can have permission to contact their references and former employers, and then do whatever tests need to be done. So that's the interview. Now, how do you end it? I would encourage you to explain the basic process from that point. Remember, this person often is without a job, or if they have a job, for whatever reason, they're eager not to have that one, or they're eager to have the one you're interviewing for. And so be gracious with them. Treat them like you would want your brother or sister to be treated, and say, look, you know, I'm going to be interviewing a few more people. I'm going to try to finalize a decision by such and such a time. I'll try to get in touch with you one way or the other by whatever. But if you have any questions, feel free to call me in the meantime. Just set them at ease. Let them know what to expect when they can expect to hear from you. Obviously, then, you need to notify the people you're not going to hire, and you need to schedule a second interview. Now, briefly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but why would you do a second interview? Well, first of all, it's only for the top 1 or 2 candidates. Now that you've interviewed your 5 or 6, let's say, you've narrowed it to a couple of people, you're going to do a second interview, and there are a couple of reasons for this. It's usually fairly brief, but you're trying to evaluate them on yet another occasion. They're also going to be more relaxed. Why? It's a second interview. That's a good sign. That means you were pleased with their first interview. And so they're going to be a little more relaxed, and you're going to get a chance to see them as they are a little more. It also lets you clear up any lingering questions from the previous interview. Maybe as you thought about it, you thought, boy, that one answer really bothered me, but I don't know, maybe I'm concentrating on that too much. So I'll just ask, listen, you mentioned this. Can you explain that a little more? So it lets you clear up lingering questions, and it lets you confirm your decision. That's really the primary reason. You get them back, you meet them again, and you sort of confirm, yes, everything I remembered about this person is true, and they do look like they're going to be a good fit. After the second interview, you only have really one thing you have to do, and that is you have to call references. Unless it's your mother, you need to call references. Let me give you an illustration of how this became crystal clearly important to me. When I was at Grace to You, early on, I think this was probably 10 years ago now, maybe a little longer, I had a man who'd been hired before I was responsible for the staff. A man who'd been hired without calling references. The staff had not called references at the time. Now, you wouldn't have thought you would needed to do that. Why? He was a master's seminary student. He was employed at Grace Community Church. Well, actually, I think he was an employee of the seminary at the time. And he was working in the seminary library. He was teaching a Bible study. It looked like, wow, how could you improve on that? Well, it became obvious that there were employment problems as a couple of months went by. Attitudes began to surface and really bizarre behavior. And one of the, I won't say who, but one of the members of the seminary staff discovered that we'd hired this person, and they were shocked. He said to me, "You hired so-and-so?" He said, we were right on the verge of firing him because, and he went on with a list of issues and concerns. And we ended up firing him as well. He threatened to sue me. He threatened, he in a meeting, had the most bizarre behavior. I don't even know how to describe it to you. It was this sort of wicked laugh. You'd say something to him and he'd throw himself back in the chair and look at the ceiling and just laugh like the devil or something. I didn't know how to describe it. It was bizarre behavior. I'm telling you, it was one of the most bizarre instances I've ever had with staff in Christian organizations. But here he was. On paper, he looked like the perfect fit. Nobody bothered because of that, and he interviewed fine. Nobody bothered to call his references. You know what? One phone call to the seminary where he was working at the time would have told us, don't get near him with a 10-foot pole. But nobody did that, and so what looked like a good deal turned out to be a nightmarish situation. And so I can't emphasize this strongly enough. Who do you call? Well, obviously you call the people they list as references, but as was mentioned last time, they're going to put the people on there that they think are going to give them this glowing recommendation. So you should call their former employers. And you should call anybody in the church you know who works specifically and directly with them. They say they're involved in a ministry, find out the person who really shepherds them and ask them very specific questions. And I've included there for you in that little packet of papers, the last sheet, is a phone reference form. Now, while we live in a sue-happy society, because of that, some people will not answer reference questions on the phone. Many will. It's really, you need to know this too. And we'll get to this when we get to libel and slander, when we get to the legal section of our class this semester. It's not wrong to give a reference about someone that's honest and straightforward. You can only be sued and they win if you have done it with evil intent, you have misrepresented the facts, and there's one other factor which escapes me right now. We'll cover that when we get there. My point is that it's fine to give references, and even ones that are less than flattering. And many people will give them to you. Here's what I suggest you follow. Just go down through here. The key issues are, of course, what would you say about his or her work? Again, open-ended questions. Get them talking. What would you say about his or her strengths, his or her weaknesses? That's a key one. How do they get along with fellow employees? And would you rehire them? And why? Not, or why would you? Several of these will get you to the heart of the issue, and you'll find out what you need to know about this person. Especially if you don't just call the people they told you to call, but you call other people whom they worked for and who know them in ministry. All right, once you've done that, if everything checks out, then basically you're making a job offer and you're going to fill out the paperwork. The job offer is real simple. You're just going to call them and say, we really would love for you to have this position, and here's what we're offering. Financially, the benefits, if you need some time to think about it, fine. If you're ready to tell us, and that's the job offer. It's as simple as that. Then fill out the necessary paperwork, and there always will be, even if you have a small church, there will always be paperwork that needs to be filled out to dot the legal I's. And then somehow you have to orient that new employee to life at your church, from what they should wear to what the hours are to what the expectations are for them, and so forth. All right, any questions about that before we move on to the next area? Yes, sir.
When you're checking references, is it okay to ask the references, do you know people who know this person, and then call those? Is that an acceptable thing to do?
But the question is it okay to ask a reference if they know someone else who knows this person and then call those people? I think it would be acceptable if you ask the applicant. In other words, if in the interview, and I usually end the interview, it's on the form there, can I call your references? If you add to that, and would you mind that I speak to other people who know you and for whom you've worked, then you're free to do that. But I wouldn't do that without their consent. I think that could appear to be a little bit of, the government does that, of course, when they're hiring certain kinds of jobs, but I don't think it would be appropriate for a church to do that.
What if they just said financially, I just can't make the ends meet with this offer, I'd really like to come, but here's my bills, and this just doesn't meet it. Would you consider that refinancing their salary, or would you look down upon that? Or
Question is, what if the person says, I'd love to work for you, but what you're offering me, I really can't make ends meet on that, and so forth. I think there are times when that's legitimate. We're going to talk next about treating your employees right. Hopefully you're offering a salary that's a living wage that they can actually survive on and prosper on. But there are also times when people have gotten themselves into difficult situations. Sometimes it's the size of their family, etc. That's where I'm going to encourage you to have a floor and a ceiling to each position. There's another mode of thinking that says, look, just find the guy you want and then pay him whatever you have to get him. Well, depending on the position, there may be some validity to that, but I think that could unfairly treat other employees who are in a similar situation. Let's say, for example, let's take the secretary illustration. There's one that comes immediately to mind. You've got a secretary in one department who's doing exactly the same role as this secretary over here in the other department, but you're paying this one more because her financial needs were more. Personally, I have a little bit of a problem with that. I think you ought to pay based on the work they're doing and the responsibility they have. And so I would discourage having too much of latitude, but I don't mind having a little bit of latitude if there are special needs, special reasons. There's a disabled child, there's a whatever, things like that. Having a sort of a range that you can move around in and have a little latitude for those who have special needs. But when that comes up, you need to, it ought to at least raise a question, because it may be legitimate and you need to consider that. It may also be illegitimate. It may be that they're living beyond their means, that they've committed themselves to too expensive leased vehicles and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and they're living beyond their means. They've kind of bought into the mindset of the age, and I want what I want, and I'm not willing to wait for it. I'm going to buy it now, even if it means I go into serious debt or I have to have more money. So that becomes a shepherding opportunity if you sort of have observed that. And usually these will be people in your church, so you'll already have a little bit of a feel for that, and you can sort of help them. Yes, sir?
When you have a conflict between the reference and the applicant in their story, who do you give the benefit of the doubt to?
You have a conflict between the reference and the applicant in the story that's given, in terms of why they left, or?
Yes, if there's an excellent employee or no, he's a terrible employee.
Yeah. That's a good question, and it's a hard one to sort out, because there are times, let's say the man was a believer and the boss was an unbeliever and hated him for his faith and is doing everything he can to sort of trash him. That happens. But I think you'll pick that up, because they won't pick out any of the strengths you picked out. You'll already have met with this person and observed some things and learned some things, and you'll observe them in the church. And so if their appraisal is completely out of step with what you have already learned and observed and what others are saying, then you discount that. Also, you get a sense in talking with people whether they're credible. Some people, you definitely get the sense that this person is giving you a straight shot. They're telling you the strengths, they're telling you the weaknesses. There's a real sort of openness and honesty about this person. Other times, as you talk with the person, if they're over the edge in everything they say, then their credibility starts coming into question. So you just have to sort of sort through it like that. Yes, sir.
When you call the people back, say you've gone through all the applications and the one that you got picked for the job, would you call them first or call the others first? Because I was thinking if you call the people who you did not choose first and told them that, we found someone else, and then you go to call that person and they'd say, well, you know what, I changed my mind.
Yeah,
Do
good
you
question.
Go back and call the other ones or what?
Talking primarily about the questions about the order of notifying these people that you've interviewed, I would not cut loose my best other 2 applicants until the one I've offered the job to has accepted it. Because the one you're offering it to may turn you down. And then you've cut these other people loose and told them, and maybe they've accepted another job now. They wanted to work for the church, but they had another job that was being offered to them, and you told them no, so now they're going to go accept that. So I would narrow it to my last 2 or 3, the ones I bring back for maybe a second interview, and I would make sure one of those is the one I want has given me a yes before I tell the other 2, I'm sorry, I've filled the position. Does that answer your question?
Yes. It seems like a big process for, or a necessary process, but for somebody like has a high turnover rate, like a secretary, especially at a church where I probably think most policies are you wouldn't want, a woman would fill that position if she's married and hasn't had kids, and all of a sudden she gets kids. Probably getting a new secretary every couple of years, probably at least, or I don't know, but just on average, on some of these lower end jobs, seems like a lot of time. But go through all these applicants. You have people involved.
This is a great question, and it gives me a chance to make a point, sort of wrap this thing up. Question is, doesn't this seem like a lot of time to put in, especially in cases where maybe with secretarial positions you sometimes have younger ladies who, you have older ladies as well, but some of the younger ladies are going to get married, they're going to have children, they're going to step out of that role. There's a lot of work going into this process. Let me just reemphasize to you that this is a relatively small amount of time to get the right person compared to the time you will spend if you get the wrong person. Trust me, the 2 are not a trade-off. If you get the wrong person and you're not careful in this process, you're going to be living with this person for a year or 2 in terms of having them on staff doing what you've hired them to do, unless there's some clear problem that you can let them go right away. But even then, the time you will spend, I've just recently gone through this, and one of your class members could attest to this if I were to ask him to. By hiring poorly, you can create a situation where so many people in your church end up spending so many hours dealing with a problem person and a problem situation, all of which would have been unnecessary if the front end were the way it should have been. Okay? So trust me, I know it seems like a lot of work, I know it seems like a lot of time, but in the end, this is so much less time and so much easier than dealing with a problem employee. Because what I mean by that is, first of all, you've got to sort of confront them. If they're a problem employee, you've got to confront them. You've got to talk about how to do that. You've got to deal with them. You've got to sort of encourage them, meet with them again. You've got to go through all of this process. Sometimes you have to meet with others and bring them into it, and then you end up letting them go. They end up threatening to sue or to go to the EOC or whomever and say that you've wrongfully discharged them. And on and on and on the time goes in dealing with a problem employee. And so much time would have been saved by doing this up front and getting a person that is the kind of person you want on your staff. You may not be doing this in every case. I'm giving you this as a process that I would encourage you to have your staff who are doing all the hiring follow. If you're in a larger church, maybe you're not doing it hands-on. If you're in a smaller church, you probably are going to be doing it hands-on in conjunction with some of the lay staff, some of the lay elders. So, very important. You will not regret spending the time to do what we've covered last week in this. I can promise you. Yes, sir?
There's a thing I've seen happen where you go to interview a whole group of people, and you go through that process you just talked about. You narrow it down to 3 people, and then you send the letters off to the ones you don't want. You got those 3 you like. You make the offer to the one you really like. They take the job, and now you got to delay maybe 2 to 3 weeks before they actually start. you cut loose the other two, and then within that 2 or 3 weeks, the person called and said, I took another job.
Yeah, it can happen. The point he's making is even if you wait until the person accepts and then you tell the other couple of applicants that were your choices, sorry, we filled it, sometimes you can still have this person say, well, I'll change my mind. I've accepted this other job now and moving on. Frankly, if they do that, that's good riddance in my mind, because that's not showing a deep commitment to the church or to their word. So at that point, I'm glad, and I'll call those couple I told I wasn't going to hire and see if I can get one of them.